Well, it would not be fun if we both said the same thing and we couldn't get into some sort of an argument. I would remind Ehud, however, that in 2006, the Bedouins conducted suicide attacks in Dahab and also against the multinational forces just outside of El Arish with suicide belts. I'll try to say things that are different from what Ehud says. The first shocker will be that I don't think that what's going on in the Sinai is particularly religious driven. It's an opportunistic time for people who want to make money, want to make a good profit from smuggling, but more important than that, from providing an infrastructure for others to move anything from bombs and bullets and so on, and I'll explain why I think that shortly. I think at the end of the day, where we both want to get to is to determine whether there is a new frontier, or from a military term, a new front to be concerned about and how to deal with it. I think the questions dealing with what the Egyptians have done so far from your part should be interesting, because the response from the Egyptians are not quite as simple as they've been put out. One other introductory comment would be that it's not so simple to amend the peace treaty. Okay, the Israeli side itself has refused, for instance, when they deployed military forces in Zone C at Rafah, to present an amendment to the treaty to the Knesset. The problem isn't just the Egyptian parliament, it's on both sides. Both sides know that you will not be able to close it again. So what happened with the deployment of forces across from Gaza was just an agreed activity, but a modified one. One that says you can deploy forces, we'll both agree to it, 750 soldiers, into the demilitarized zone, but that it can be reviewed, and should be reviewed, every 6 months to see if it should go on. In practice, however, both sides know that once the Egyptians are in that box, they're not leaving, and the Israelis have never asked them to leave. It's important to note that the Egyptians had asked for that deployment for almost 10 years before Israel agreed. And Israel agreed because it was pulling out of Gaza. The same thing with the rest of Zone C along the border. The Egyptians have been asking for quite some time, years, not months, not just last year, to put the military forces in that Zone C, and that's been denied by the Israeli side. So there are two sides to the issue, just like smuggling. Smuggling doesn't stop at the border. Somebody on the other side is taking goods, whether it's human chattel or whether it's drugs or anything else, and there is smuggling in the other direction, Israel to Egypt as well. So what I want to do is paint a picture that's a little broader and includes other tidbits of information that might help you assess what's going on. Now, when the Israelis pulled out of the Sinai in 1982, something interesting happened. During the Israeli presence, many Bedouins thought they'd been well treated by the Israelis. There had been a small group of jihadists, but generally unsuccessful. But many others thought that the schools had received attention, medical support was good, and I won't say they had collaborated, but they had lived fairly well. And as a result, were found suspect by the Egyptian government and military when it took over again in the Sinai. Now, let's remember also that with the Israeli presence, the contact between Sinai Bedouins and Negev Bedouins was encouraged, and there were good relations. So there was no little string of wire keeping them apart, not that that's ever been effective or respected, but the actual commingling and family play was encouraged. So the Bedouins have always been comfortable with that relationship, and that includes going into Gaza. But because the government didn't trust the Bedouins, and they just painted everyone as evil after 1982, security remained very tight and under the Directorate of Military Intelligence, which created this Bureau of Bedouin Affairs that we just mentioned. And over time, the Bedouins and the military actually found ways to cooperate. And the way they cooperated was they stayed out of each other's way as much as possible. And of course, for 10, 15 years, there wasn't much by way of smuggling. It was the usual white slavery, some gems moving back and forth, some drugs and so on, but there was never really a strong momentum to oppose the government. But the government never came forward. It was very slow in developing the governorate of initially just El Arish, and then 2 governorates, El Arish and Tor for South Sinai. But no big programs came forward, and the Bedouins didn't really benefit from the development of the Gulf of Aqaba, the mines over in the Mahala Mountains, and the particularly turquoise and so on, nor the gas and oil development along the Gulf of Suez. So they felt kind of out of the picture. Many along the Gulf of Aqaba moved inland into the Sinai proper. Nomadism continued for the most part. But as as you know, Bedouins are not homogeneous. They're not all nomads, they're not all. There's businessmen, fishermen, camel herders, and so on. They're different. You even have the Jabaliya who take care of St. Catherine's. But they have among themselves sort of a tribal congress that settles their own business. I think Rob mentioned West Virginia to compare size. I'll use West Virginia to compare personalities and characters. I mean, they want to settle things themselves. They're very proud. They're very inward-looking. They'll accept assistance from Washington as long as there's no strings attached, in this case from Cairo. But Bedouins don't want to be Egyptians, as you pointed out, and the Egyptians don't want to be Bedouins. So there's no kind of connection there whatsoever. Anyway, by the early 2000s, you'd had now some 15, 18 years of the government doing very little except developing its own projects for tourism, oil and gas, and so on. And the Bedouins by then had started sending their children to schools like in Zagazig, which was a hotbed of the Brotherhood, and other universities in Egypt. But they weren't benefiting from government jobs, military jobs, or any other significant investment. Likewise, because there were no jobs, many of them were going to Saudi Arabia and like places where they picked up on Wahhabism and so on, and came back home with some great ideas, or at least new ideas. Okay? Now, many of them could not do anything when they came back home, even with their degrees and so on. So if you look at the first, what we call a terrorist group, the Tawhid wa Jihad, which was founded roughly in 2003, 2004, sort of Salafist-based, but with branches linked to Gaza with Mr. Samadana, with the PRC. These people had a group or a branch that was responsible for promoting Salafism, but the other branches included infrastructure, logistics, and so on, and very, very tight little cells. But more important, in my view, is that logistic and infrastructure branch, which was based out of the Tarabain in the Halal Mountains. These guys, when finally caught, were caught for one big reason. You had the 3 major sets of terrorist attacks from 2004 to 2006 in Taba, Sharm el-Sheikh, and Dahab. After Dahab, after seeing that more Egyptians were being killed than tourists, etc., the population started turning these guys in. The Shanu brothers, the Falafel guys, all came out of the Halal Mountains and the Tarabain. And they found computers, disks with names and operations and so on, which implied that there was a developed infrastructure going back some 10 years, fairly advanced, and certainly more advanced than anyone had anticipated. So after these guys were turned in, and many, if not most, were caught because of information derived from the CDs and so on, things went quiet for a while, and the Bedouins tried moving on a political side. I would say 2007, 2008, you saw development of political parties and so on. But the military reaction was, and also security services, was to arrest anybody who declared any opposition to government. But the other thing that had happened because of the terrorist activities is the security services, well described as being corrupt, particularly from Taba and that area, was bloated with police to investigate the terrorist actions. This, to me, was a turning point, because in El Arish, for instance, some 5,000 plus people were arrested, just blanket arrests. Prisoners were mistreated, including women and so forth. And the cleavage that had already started developing between the military and the police and security services became wider. The Bedouins opted to link and to stay close to the military and asked for the removal of the security services, which the government didn't do. So this attempt at separating them and having them operate separately became very strong from 2004 forward. And one of the reasons was the security services brought police in from Giza and other parts of Cairo with no experience working with Bedouins, who didn't bother knocking or coming to homes in the middle of the night and dragging people away. And it just created a terrible environment. And the security services have never recovered. And I'll show you why that is important now as we get to 2011. Well, anyway, about 2008, you had Cast Lead and you had sieges of Gaza. And this is where everybody got away from the politics, mainly because the speakers, the activists, had been arrested, including one particular guy, Abu Lafi. And this guy comes back in a picture later on. But with the siege and with the increased demand for goods in Gaza came the real era of tunnels. Before that, we had little tunnels and closets. Maybe a few items were going through. No matter how we want to characterize it, it was small potatoes. It required very little cooperation among the tribes. It was successful for nickel dime. But all of a sudden, you started seeing real tunnels. I mean, we're talking, small car tunnels where you could drive through and come up on the other side. Pipelines going underneath to Gaza. Serious money. You could go into a store in Rafah, as did one of my friends who wanted to buy something in a family store, and was told very specifically, don't touch anything on this side. We have a buyer. You can only buy on the other side. Okay? We saw people talking to the police and arranging when deliveries could be made from one side to the other. So you had a lot of things going on at the same time. Big money, big support and coordination with the security and military forces. And the reason was the government wanted to keep hands off, except for major weapon systems, as far as I'm concerned. But everything else was fair game. You didn't raid a warehouse. Like there was a big warehouse full of cement near Rafah. A young captain, a police captain, heard about it, took a team to raid it, and is now, I think, a private someplace in Cairo, because he basically affected the palm of several of his superiors and was told to never again launch an operation on his own. And the word was put out, do not raid any place without checking with the bosses. Okay? So this is the environment that was coming up. Big cargoes and convoys were coming across the Sinai. You don't do this with just one tribe. We talked about the Taliban, but again, the Sawarka were involved, and other tribes all the way to the Gulf of Aqaba. So what do you need when you move this sort of stuff at night? And you have other prowling tribes who might jump you. I mean, you need outriders, guns, jeeps, motorcycles. So we started seeing not just a few Toyota trucks, but hundreds of Toyotas without plates, prominent in the towns around North Sinai. And everybody knew very well what these were for. But you were developing a bunch of kids, basically, with AK-47s, with new motorcycles, with new sunglasses, with new Toyotas and Rolexes, who wanted to make sure that they didn't lose this stuff, that they didn't lose the profits from smuggling. Some turned to basically thuggish activities, doing some carjackings and killing of folks in El Arish. So you had a new generation. And something even more importantly, going through 2010, is the tribes, now that they were working together on business, started, particularly the young guys, started meeting together. Prior to that, every group would stay by itself, or else they show up in a bar or a tea shop and start fighting. But now they started talking to each other. You had the blogs, you had the tea houses. You basically took Chicago and Al Capone, all the multiple gangs, free to meet and without being harassed by anyone. Anytime the police tried seriously in response to Cairo to do something, to go to Wadi Amr or someplace like that, they got their butts beat. I mean, seriously. And because the new weaponry present, including RPGs and so on, was terrific against APCs, armored personnel carriers, and blew out their tires, so the cops would stay stuck in the desert. Many were arrested or taken hostage. And there was still a differentiation. This is police action because the military couldn't go there. And as you might guess, some of the police are actually military in disguise. But the Bedouins, when they found out, for instance, that one hostage was an army general, rather than making a demand, just simply let him go. So we don't want to mess with the army, we want to mess with security services. Okay. So when we arrive at the point of the revolution last year, you basically had a North Sinai that was cowboyist, kind of Western America. Everybody's got a gun, and everyone else is cooperating, because every time somebody would be arrested, some policeman would get killed, and the government was trying to figure out, how do you balance this? Particularly now that you've cooperated so much and allowed this to go on, how do you pull back? And they still haven't figured out how they're going to do that. Okay. So in the revolution, when it started in Cairo, I want to go through a couple of tidbits, because I asked someone recently who was there to give me some notes. It says part of the problem started with the releasing of activists. A lot of jails were opened up, a lot of people were released. Increasing clashes between government and Bedouins. And of course, the media was pretty open in explaining what's going on in Cairo, linking it to the issues of the Sinai, and the Bedouins weren't going to miss a chance to really put more pressure on the security services, just as was being done in Cairo proper. From 25 to 27 January, about 2,000 demonstrators went to Sheikh Zayed police station, surrounded it, and the interior forces were not able to stop them, so they fired live bullets at the crowd, with one victim. The Bedouins responded not only by using live bullets, but also RPGs, and took down the Sheikh Zayed police station. Now, keep in mind that there's several actions that took place against police stations. In some places, the police stations were burned down, but ironically, nobody had attacked them. So suspicion was some of the police were burning up their places, so they could go home and avoid being killed. From 28 January to 3 February, reflecting the day of anger in Cairo, state security premises in Rafah were shot at, and there was a bomb targeting it. Civilians were killed, and after Mubarak's speech, there was more activity in the region. And actually, towards the 2nd of February or so, there were pro-Mubarak marches, but then you had the camel attack, the famous camel attack in Tahrir Square in Cairo, and the Sinai responded to that very violently, attacking a lot of places and the government offices. Went on to schools, to any public office, to military apartments and homes and clubs, and just stripped everything bare. Okay. Again, from 4 to 11 February, 20,000 demonstrators reported in Real Arish at the El Rifai Mosque. And now we're seeing not just RPGs, but bombs and hand grenades and so on, and the gas pipeline attacked, etc. So what do we have now? We have this sort of religious movement in there, but the key is a group has been formed, led by Abu Lafer that I mentioned earlier. And so the smugglers, with their weapons, with their capacity, have been joined by people released from jail, some Bedouins, some not, who had been either tried in absentia or were in fact from jails and released. They've merged. They've merged and are residing in the Wadi al-Amr area and also in the Halal Mountains. They are well armed. I can't vouch for whether they have the sophisticated surface-to-air missiles or not, but they're certainly well armed. And we've seen machine guns fired when I was with the MFO, people going back and forth. This group is a group to worry about, as far as I'm concerned. These are the guys that will facilitate movements of whether it's Hamas or whether it's the Islamic Army, anything for which they can get paid a handsome sum. And they control the Sinai, or trying to control the Sinai. How do they do that? The Sinai is like a big ocean. Okay? There are limited formal roads, but the rest is open. You can move things through the Sinai unseen quite easily. There is not a great intelligence overhead system to watch all this. And you can attack, you can protect key points, you can attack their villages and their mountain strongholds. You will not defeat them there. But even if you do, you eventually have to leave. If you're not going to have a plan to permanently leave thousands of troops there, the troops will back off, the police will back off, and then the roadways, the formal roadways of the Sinai are fair game. As was done one time after Wadi al-Amr attack, commercial trucks coming to El Alga, going to Israel, private transportation were attacked throughout the Sinai, which, by the way, has always been a concern of the multinational forces, trying to stay objective, because you cannot have a convoy for every movement you see during the day, and you can be ambushed in 1,000 different locations. So whoever owns the deserts, whoever owns the sea of sand, so to speak, really can retaliate quite quickly and cause serious damage. So what these guys also have right now, the government has conceded to them, is an ability to meet with the other tribes in a little town called Mahdiya. The security forces and military do not go into that town without announcing first that they're coming. Okay. So this is how much control the bad guys have. But again, if you attack them in force, they can retaliate pretty effectively. I'll leave it at that, except to point out they even attacked an amusement park not long ago, where there were quite a few families in El Arish, is a small amusement park. So the thuggery part of what they're doing is incredible. So what do we have left? We have 4 groups. We have Bedouins who, really, the majority, who just want to stay away from all this, just lead their lives. We have a group, particularly the Romailat tribe that's in Rafah on the border, that wants the status quo. They're making a bundle from smuggling and renting tunnels out by the hour. So they'd rather see no change whatsoever. Then you have another group of politicians trying to come back up, and mostly leftists, and deal with the government in Cairo without much luck. I may point out, you said there were no proposals for developing the Sinai. I recall a member of the Shura Council told me one day, he said, we understand the problem, and we established a grand design for the Sinai. So I asked him when that would start. He said, I don't know, we have a lot of grand designs, but if anybody asks, we have a grand design. And it certainly wasn't at the top. Okay? And the last group they've got is this new, very criminal, capably armed group. And the government, the governorate in particular of North Sinai, doesn't know how to bring them under control. The military will only be temporarily inside Zone C unless there are some changes which will allow an agreed activity to be extended automatically every 30, 60, or 90 days. But I don't see the treaty being reopened at any time soon. Now, having said all this, after Mubarak was removed and the military was trying to figure out what it would do in the future with the Sinai, I checked with some generals who worked with the Sinai before, and they said the Sinai is different from Egypt. We are going to retain control of the Sinai no matter what it takes. Now, they can't do it by themselves. They can't get their permissions to deploy by themselves. They have to get cooperation from Israel, and this is where we agree 100%. Thank you.